Good evening. Let's begin with a prayer tonight. Father, we're so thankful for opportunities like this where we can open your word, especially the Old Testament, and spend time there and understand more about your nature and character and how you've interacted with people throughout the centuries. Father, we're thankful for your love and your mercy and your grace. We're thankful that you love us enough to give us your word and that you care for us enough to send your Son for us. Help us, Father, always to value those blessings and help us to order our lives in view of them. Thank you so much for this church family. Let's be with Brother Berkley this evening in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good evening. Have your Bible ready in the Old Testament in the book of Judges. I'm going to start with 4 fast facts. We will open up some passages in the book of Judges, and all of our study has a very clear destination. We are moving toward what we can learn and how that knowledge can be applied in our lives. The book of Judges. And I'm going to start with 4 fast facts. In the timeline of Bible history, the book of Judges picks up where Joshua leaves off. And this is before the time of Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. Number 2, the judges in this context are not cloaked officials who preside in court. They are deliverers God sent to rescue the people. Number 3, the geographic setting of this book is not just in one location. A variety of different tribes and locations come up in the book of Judges. Number 4, the disgrace of this time period is, of course, sin that was repeated over and over again. 21 chapters, probably written about 1050 BC, most likely by Samuel. There is, early in the book of Judges, a good summation of the content. We're going to read Judges chapter 2, 16 through 23. I'm reading from the English Standard Version in Judges chapter 2, 16 through 23. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. So departure from God happened over and over, time after time. And it happened in various regions of Israel. And we're talking about the land God gave to his people. God reacted against sin and that's the anger of the Lord reference in verse 20. But look back at verse 17, and this describes the lifestyle of choice during that era. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not. In this passage we've just read, Judges 2, 16 to 23, you have a summary statement of what happened during this era of Old Testament history. And you see it again over and over again. And this graphic has been used by preachers and teachers for a long time. And it moves into chapter 3 where you see exactly the same thing. The people turned from God, chapter 3, verse 7. God judges by delivering the people to their enemies in verse 8. The people turn back to God for a time. God then sends a judge to rescue the people, chapter 3, 9 to 10. And there's a period of peace under the judge, and then the people turn again. So this happens over and over again. I'm going to pause here for your questions or your feedback or your initial comments about Judges, and then we're going to move ahead. Joey. Okay. Every day, the Israelite people in the land God gave them, every day these people got up and had to make the choices that all of us have to make. Serve God or follow the desires and preferences of self, generally fueled by the culture around us. It had been their duty to drive the Canaanites out of the land, but after the death of Joshua, that duty was not discharged as fully as necessary, and so God didn't drive all those nations out, we just read. And so you have a culture driven by idolatry, sexual immorality, many different forms of corruption allowed into the communities and into their hearts, and this cycle of sin and repeated apostasy rules the day. One more thing before I take us to another specific passage in Judges. The book of Judges is not about a series of good role models. That's not what it's about. Though there were a few good examples like Othniel and Deborah, and they're early in the book, good role models do not dominate the narrative in the book of Judges. Of course, God is always present in His perfection and His grace and His justice. God used good people, God used bad people. His high providence and purpose was present all through this time, though without interfering with the free will of the human race. So I'm going to say God is the main actor throughout the book. Other people come onto the stage and leave. God is the main actor throughout the book. So in this Old Testament book on display before us tonight, the perfect mercy and justice of God. In contrast, the disobedience and decline of a people who come back every now and then, but then they fall back into their previous ways. And here is the keynote statement: every man did what? What was right in his own eyes. If you forget everything else in the book of Judges, we always remember that. Before moving forward, two things. One having to do with chronology. Good luck with that. Chronology is sometimes, especially when you get further into the book, hard to put together. This chart exhibits with the red down there who the oppressors were. That would be nations God used to punish His people. And you start out with Othniel, Ehud, Sham. How many of you in a Bible class when you were in junior high and high school had to memorize the list of judges? Well, several of you. You just don't want to raise your hand because you're afraid I'm going to say, name them. They're on the chart. We had to remember all these. At the bottom, the oppressors, and you can see that when you get to the latter part of the book of Judges, it gets rather complicated to sort all this out. And one reason for that is that we're talking about not just Israel as a whole. It was not, they didn't have a central government. Closest they came to that was that people came to Shiloh every now and then. But there wasn't a central government, and so you've got what happened up here, and then what happened over here, and the map is exhibiting to us the diversity of the regional or geographic aspect of the book. You with me there? Different places, not a central government. All right, before I go on, anything you want to say? Then I'm going to take us to an episode that's in the book of Judges. Turn to chapter 13. Judges chapter 13. An important preliminary before we do some reading here. These stories in the book of Judges are dramatic, they're interesting, and in some ways they're really entertaining. But that's not the point. The point is to see all through Old Testament history, God's plan and purpose is leading events toward the sending of His Son. We learn moral lessons. We are warned by many episodes in the book of Judges. It's interesting, entertaining, dynamic, dramatic, but God's plan and purpose is always in the background, and very often it's in the foreground. Everything has movement toward the coming of Christ. I'd like to tell the story and do some reading about Samson, and then we'll nail down some practical lessons and principles from this part of the Old Testament. And again, we will observe the providential action of God. So in chapter 13 of Judges, I'm going to talk about some of this, and then when I get further into chapter 14, we'll do some reading. Chapter 13 begins with the people of Israel doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord. And I want you to mark this word. There is a single word here that is significant in keeping with what we've already observed. Chapter 13, verse 1, the people of Israel, you see that next word? Again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. During this time, Samson was born, and as Judges 13 is read, it is clear, made clear by an angel of God, Samson would be instrumental in God's dealings with His people going forward, even when Samson was acting on his own motives, driven by his own pride. Remember, God uses good people, God uses bad people. God was using all of this in the interest of His ultimate purpose. Now let's talk about that in terms of an immediate purpose and an ultimate purpose. The immediate purpose was to deliver His people from their enemies. He's using Samson for that. The ultimate purpose is everything is movement toward the coming of Christ. So in chapter 13, let's talk about some of that. God, through the angel, is present in all this dialogue, and verse 9 says that God listened to the voice of Manoah, whose wife was barren. So you have God listening. You have God involved in this. And you come to verse 25 in chapter 13, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir. So as chapter 13 begins, and as you continue to read through it, all the way through verse 25, God is involved in these events that are occurring on ground level. God is involved in all of this, and actually there's more about God in this than Samson. You with me? Now, chapter 14. Samson's marriage to a Philistine woman, and the events began to take a downward turn. And when I say a downward turn, I want you to look, please, at the opening verse in Judges 14. Samson went down. You can just stop there for a moment and use that as sort of thematic in the rest of the chapter. Samson went down. And verse 4 says, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord. So Samson is making a trip in fulfillment of a desire that he has. God is using these events for his purposes. I think it's interesting in chapter 14, in verse 1, verse 5, verse 7, and verse 10, Samson went down. Now, it might be argued that that was geographic, but really it is a commentary. It becomes a commentary on the decline of the people in that time. They were going down. Samson went down. The parents resisted Samson's desire for a Philistine wife. Samson rejected the appeal of his parents' wisdom, and he actually said, "Get her for me." Verse 4 in chapter 14 gives some insight about this. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. So mark that down, from the Lord. The Lord had a plan to use all of the ill-conceived manhood of Samson to accomplish his purpose. Later in the story, we will conclude Samson knew what the Lord wanted, but it was very late in Samson's life that he offered that acknowledgement. Now, as you read further into the story about Samson, you discover some rather dramatic episodes. In chapter 14, he killed a lion barehanded. After that, 30 Philistines at Ashkelon. In chapter 15, 300 foxes and a massive fire, 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone. Strength, but not always under good discipline. Very dramatic episode showing the power of God in this time to use a man's strengths and his weaknesses for his purpose. I think we're ready for Judges 16, but I'm going to pause again. Comments, feedback, questions. Judges chapter 16. Samson visits a prostitute in Gaza. And this sinful and reckless behavior makes Samson an easy target, so the Gazites, who are Philistines, waited for Samson. But when Samson came out, he tore the gates of Gaza down, put them on his shoulders, and carried them away. That brings us now to our reading that's going to begin in verse 4 of 1 Samuel chapter 16. After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, "Seduce him, and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound, that no one could subdue you." I'm at verse 7. Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber. And she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings, as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Verse 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound." And he said to her, "If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies." You have to put the tone of voice in there. "Tell me how you might be bound." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web, and she made them tight with the pin and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. And she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies." And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up again, for he has told me all his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. This is one of the most famous, or I should say infamous, couples in the Bible, Samson and Delilah. The Philistines see an opportunity, but God has engineered his own opportunity. So they approach Delilah and promise her money if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength. What you have here is a man with an addictive weakness and a woman who is greedy and enemies who are brutal. Now that's the making of chaos in the form of drama. A man with an addictive weakness, a woman who is greedy, and enemies who are brutal. In this story, there's all the things that make up what modern stories are often made up of, movies in particular: wealth, power, politics, sex, pride. And all of this goes to the culture of that time and the degenerate lifestyle that obtained in that era. Samson lies. He plays this dangerous game. He seems to have an overconfident love of danger. Samson and Delilah are an extreme case of using one another rather than serving one another. And God is nowhere in their mentality or plans, but we know that God is not absent in these events. It may seem that God's purposes are hidden somewhere in all this chaos. However, when we get to the end of the story, it's clear God used these flawed people and these circumstances on the ground to carry out His purpose, but without forcing anyone to do anything against their will. And the end of the story, of course, is from verses 23 down through verse 31. And in many Bibles, you have the heading that says, the death of Samson. I need to get to my takeaways. I'm going to let you read that last section on your own. It's about the death of Samson. Takeaways. I believe we need to talk about generational apostasy and how to prevent that. It's all over the book of Judges. Here's a simple way to describe what I'm talking about, and it's illustrated in Judges. Have you ever observed this? Strong, faithful parents, active elders in the church, good teachers and preachers, a spiritually strong, well-informed, zealous generation. Their children, not so much. The children have not abandoned the Lord altogether, but they're not as involved as their parents. Their attendance is not that faithful. They're more attracted to the world. Then what happens with their children, the third generation? In many cases, everyone does what's right in his own eyes. Generational apostasy. I've had people say to me something like this, very honestly: my grandparents were really faithful and involved in the church. My parents were too, but not so much. And I just haven't found it to be valuable for me. That's generational apostasy. The third generation has forgotten why their parents and grandparents were devoted to the Lord, even though their parents were not as devoted as their grandparents. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. What can we do to prevent this? It's your turn. Prevent it.
Because everyone's a free agent. We can help discourage it.
Let me change my wording. What can we do to discourage it? What can we do to fulfill our duty to the full extent we can so that this doesn't happen? Just name some things we can do. Teach and preach.
Psalm 78 says that we need to remember the commandments and the statutes of God and to recognize the importance of passing things on. It's the good things of God.
I've got it right here open. Tell the next generation. Psalm 78 gives us what we need to be doing now. Tell the next generation the goodness of God. We cannot force truth into the lives of our children and grandchildren, but can we do more? You think we can do more? I think we can do more. We are obligated to God in this matter to tell the works of the Lord to the coming generations. Maybe what we ought to do is revisit how we do that. Parents having conversations with your children, not just taking them to a building. Parents having direct conversations with your children about their relationship with the Lord. Praying with them, studying with them, talking with them, not just the old philosophy that says, well, I took them to Sunday school, I took them to the building. Example, that's very important. There are opportunities with young people that create things we can do to prevent what we're talking about. What else? Yes, sir. That does. Does that passage say, bring the child to the building? No, it's more than that, isn't it? Now, bring them to the building, but it's more than that. A lot of other things are involved. Number 2, no unity and peace when everybody does what's right in his own eyes. Number 3, Samson could be called the strongest weak man in the Bible. Number 4, your strengths can become your weaknesses. Number 5, sin can take you further than you imagined. And then, I want to bring up this. Every man did what was right in whose eyes? His own eyes. Here's where I want to end. There's another set of eyes. Proverbs 15:3, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. Proverbs 5:21, for a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. In Matthew 6, your Father sees what is done in secret. In Lamentations, the Lord from heaven is looking down and seeing what people are doing. And one more thing. I've got 2 minutes to cover this. How did Samson ever get into Hebrews 11?
So you tell me.
That's why you came tonight. I think at the very end, Samson acknowledged God's role in the episodes. And if you read that in Judges, that's all I could come up with. What we're talking about is the passage in Hebrews 11 where a number of people are commended. Now, what if you come into faith in God and acknowledging His faith late in life? Is there not a parable that indicates your standing with God is there even though you come in late? And I think that's the way Solomon got into Hebrews chapter 11. Anything else? 1 minute. A lot of material to cover. Let's don't take the pathway of Samson. Thank you very much for your good attention to our study.